Dear organizers, thank you very much for the great opportunity to be here with you and to present in this wonderful panel. Although I have to mention it is not as big of a pleasure to be the last presenter. In my presentation, I would like to focus on the liberalization of the electricity sector. And I would like to also discuss how the liberalization was implemented within Hungary. And in the end, I will take a look at whether the liberalization process was successful or there are some shortcomings in the system. In the life of the community, two of the founding treaties specifically concerned energy. The ECSC treaty established a common market within the coal sector, which at that time was the most important source of energy, while the Euratom Treaty a few years later aimed to facilitate the more widespread use of nuclear energy. Even though the community was founded on these so-called pillars of energy, the next few decades were characterized by a general unwillingness to deepen the community's role in this sector. The Commission tried multiple times to convince the Council to strengthen the community's role, especially with regards to energy supply issues, but it was unsuccessful due to the very specific nature of the topic. In the 1980s, a few important things have emerged. The UK opted for a liberalized market, as it was previously said, although it has to be mentioned that this liberalization only meant that the previously state-owned companies went into, state-owned monopolies went into private hands. In the following years, a few important things happened as well. With regards to environmental policy, there was some advancing, and which triggered also some changes in the energy market, as there was need for cleaner energy and there was need for investment. Also, it has to be mentioned that at that time there were some corruption scandals and there were some general skepticism whether the state-owned monopolies are the only way to supply our energy. In 1988, the Commission working document on the internal energy market was adopted. It suggested a shift towards a more integrated energy market that can help reducing the prices, and at the same time it can also help the environment. It wasn't really successful, as the liberalization only began actually 8 years after this. What has to be mentioned that before we get to the first energy package, there were some fundamental directives adopted that served as a basis for the future liberalization. The first one was the directive on the transit of electricity through transmission grids. It aimed to facilitate the transit of electricity through transmission grids by involving the Commission in the granting of transit contracts. In addition to this, the directive on the transparency of gas and electricity prices charged to industrial end users was adopted. That said that the transparency of prices are very important to the internal market, so it required that certain industrial end users had to publish their electricity and gas prices to the Statistical Office of the European Communities. At this point we get to the Maastricht Treaty, as it was already mentioned. They were planning on including a separate chapter for energy, but the states were quite reluctant to do it, so in the end it was addressed more specifically within the area of trans-European networks and the environment. Before explaining what the first energy package was, it is, I think, quite important to highlight how did the electricity sectors of the member states usually look like. And also it is important to highlight what are the specifics of electricity. It is important to mention that electricity's price usually depends on the way how it is produced. Even today, and back then especially, it cannot really be stored. For someone who is dependent on it, it cannot really be replaced with anything else. So this sector was generally represented by these vertically integrated electricity monopolies. They were responsible for the generation, the transmission, and the distribution of electricity. In this sector, it became quite apparent that there is need for the mere abolishment of the restrictions of trade is not going to be enough. There was a need for an ideological change and also for infrastructural reforms. With this, we get to the first liberalization package that was adopted in 1996. The directive concerning common rules for the internal market in electricity was adopted. It concerned the whole electricity chain from from production to distribution. A few things that I would like to highlight from this directive is that with regards to the construction of new generation capacity, there were two procedures to do it. There was either the authorization or the tendering procedure. With regards to the third-party access to the transmission and distribution systems, it listed three possibilities that can be seen on the slide. The first one was the negotiated, then was the regulated, and finally the single buyer procedure. But most importantly, the first package also started the unbundling procedure of these vertically integrated companies by requiring that these undertakings kept separate accounts for their distribution, their generation, and their transmission activities. Regarding this first package, is very well summed up by Lee Hancher, who is an expert in this field. She said that this was, in its loosest sense of the word, a framework, and well, it left a lot of discretion to the states, but I think it's not very surprising due to the fact that the previous attempts to deepen the community's role in this sector were unsuccessful. With this, I would like to explain also how the first package was implemented in Hungary. As a precondition to this, in the 1990s, the privatization of the energy companies began. That had also its set of challenges later on. And in 2001, the Act on Electricity was adopted that implemented the 1996 package. Interestingly, this Act on Electricity opted for a quite interesting Portuguese market model, that was this dual market model. In it, there was a difference between the eligible consumers and those who get electricity from public utility service providers. In practice, actually, the internal market appeared as a sort of alternative to this fixed price market. Also, it is worth mentioning regarding the eligible consumers that in 2002 there was a government decree which listed that who are going to be the eligible consumers. It said that from 2003, all large consumers, which was approximately 33% of the market. Then from July 2004, it's going to be everyone except the households, which was, together with the first one, it was 66%. And from 2007, July, all household consumers became eligible. Already within the first package, there was a requirement that the Commission is going to assess the experiences gained from it. It did so, and the results were not so satisfying. Still, market dominance remained, and consumers experienced higher prices in certain instances. In this climate, the acceleration energy package was adopted in 2003, which had multiple directives and regulations. Most importantly, this new directive concerning common rules for the internal market in electricity was adopted. Contrary to the previous one, now when constructing new generation capacity, the default procedure was authorization, and the tendering can only be used if the capacity reached through the authorization procedure was not enough. Regarding the third-party access to the systems, it now stated that only regulated third-party access is possible. The unbundling procedure also continued with the legal unbundling of the system operators, and also at this point independent regulatory authorities were introduced that were responsible for the non-discrimination, the effective competition, and the effective functioning of the market. Yes, in Hungary, with the adoption of the second package, it became, and also our membership joining to the EU became closer and closer. It became quite apparent that the previous dual market is not sustainable anymore. So with this, a new market model was developed in 2004, and it was adopted with the 2007 Act on Electricity. In this new market model, the previous public service utility providers ceased to exist, and they were replaced by the universal suppliers more or less. And then also at this point, it is quite important to mention that contrary to the previous model, these universal suppliers could not only purchase electricity from MVM, the Hungarian Electricity Works, but they could purchase it from anywhere on the market. In 2005, the Commission again launched an inquiry into the sector, and the results were again not so satisfying. Still market dominance existed. Some consumers complained about the higher prices. So in order to tackle this, they developed the 2009 third energy package. At this point, another new directive concerning common rules for the internal market was adopted. That the most important part from it is that the rules of unbundling continued. It provided three options, as already said in the morning by the previous presenter. And the default one was the ownership unbundling, but states were quite reluctant to go for this option, so two alternatives were introduced: the independent system operator and the independent transmission operator as well. Furthermore, the directive strengthened the role of the national regulatory authorities. Now they were responsible for fixing or approving transmission tariffs and also ensuring the compliance with the rules of the directive. At this point, it became quite apparent that some cooperation between these national regulatory authorities is important. So ACER, the Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators, was also adopted. ACER usually issues non-binding opinions, but in some cases they can issue binding decision, for example, like with regards to access to cross-border networks. In Hungary, this new package was adopted in 2007 into the old, by amending the old 2007 Act on Electricity. What was the biggest change is that in Hungary we opted for the previously mentioned, with regards to the transmission system operators, we opted for the independent transmission system operator model. At this point, it's also worth mentioning that in 2010 the Hungarian Power Exchange started its operation. In 2019, the fourth package was adopted. It included several regulations and directives again. But the main aim of this package was not the liberalization, but more a transition towards cleaner energies. Although it has to be mentioned that it finessed the rules in certain areas of the liberalization and in the case of unbundling. But its biggest achievement was by introducing that market-based supply prices, that from this point onwards the member states should primarily ensure the protection of the poor and vulnerable consumers by social policy and not by price setting. In Hungary, this new package was adopted in 2020, and with this three new actors appeared in the legislation: the aggregators, the energy communities, and finally the active consumers, although it has to be mentioned that as far as I know we don't have any aggregators yet in Hungary. Finally, what I would like to talk about is that how successful this liberalization was, whether it reached all its goals or not. The critics of the liberalization usually say that first, it did not help solving electricity poverty. Some say that abolishing state-owned monopolies actually only resulted in international monopolies that used it as an opportunity to expand beyond their national borders. Some also say that it didn't really help with reaching cleaner energy. And also the biggest argument against it is that for some consumers it didn't actually result in any lower prices and just increase of prices. The first thing that I took a look at is that whether the wholesale markets and the generation companies, whether there was an increase in the largest generating companies, or whether there was a decrease. As we can see, in most of the cases there was a decrease, although in some instances it was quite minimal. And in some cases, like for example in Hungary, the largest electricity generators market share grew over the years. But all in all, if we look at some other countries, then we can say that at this level, I think the liberalization was more or less successful, but by no means extraordinarily successful. The second issue that I would like to take a look at is the already mentioned retailers. with regards to retailers, it's as when consumers become eligible, it is very important if they actually have a choice, how many retailers there are. With regards to this, it is there is no clear tendency whether the number of the retailers have increased or decreased. It depends on the country, so no conclusions can be drawn for this. And also, if you look at some other statistics with regards to retailers that have more than 5% market share, then we can see that some dominant positions still very much exist on the retail market. For example, in the case of Portugal, those 5 retailers are responsible for 90% market share. In France, those 3 retailers are responsible for 70+% market share. In Hungary, those 4 are also around 70, and in Poland, it's also they are approximately responsible for 70% market share. The last thing that I took a look at is from the perspective of domestic customers. I think that with regards to the industry, it very much depends on how big the companies were, because in there, with regards to the industry, we've seen some price decreases, but compared to this, with regards to the domestic prices, we've actually seen an increase. This is on the whole European level. We can see that there was a clear tendency that prices were increasing over time. So in this sense, I don't really think that with regards to the domestic consumers, it was very much successful. I would like to conclude my presentation by saying that the liberalization process has been ongoing for almost 30 years, but it has to be said that it was not completely successful with reaching its goals. There are still some places where it hasn't reached its aims. It's an unfinished process. The Commission also concluded with regards to the retail market a study, and they found that there are some very much existent barriers in front of the retail markets. What they have found is that dominant positions very much exist, and also it's very important from the perspective of changing retailers that customers are unaware that they can change the retailers and they wouldn't do it. So then it's not really useful if you have so many retailers. So the question is that what can be learned from this? Should we continue with the liberalization process, or are there any other solutions? Yeah, that's the question. Thank you very much.